Sean,
Awesome.
go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, will do. I'm just going to set up the presentation here. Cool. Can you guys see that?
Yes,
I see
looks
it.
good.
Super. So, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Sean Gordon. I'm a National Security Systems Analyst at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I'm the Principal Investigator for the Wind Supply Chain Security Project. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of my project, and I'm going to focus on the SBOM elements. I'd like to acknowledge the fact that this is a project also in conjunction with INL, and I will be focusing on the SBOM contribution, which is on the Lawrence Livermore side. Super. So my strategy for today to kind of talk to you guys about the project is to first talk about the problem statement, essentially why the project exists. And then I'd like to talk about the project itself. I'm going to break the project down into kind of 3 different phases. And then I'm just going to give a quick summary of how the project is addressing the problems that we're trying to resolve and look into. So without further ado, I'm going to start out with the problem statement. So kind of discuss, why does the project exist? So the project exists because the DOE would like to understand how supply chain attacks can affect wind power generation, and if there are unique supply chain threats to wind power generation. So that's among the principal concerns. And to kind of accomplish the task of addressing those concerns, the project seeks to answer the questions beneath that statement. So I won't read those exact questions off, but I will be referring to them throughout this presentation. Yeah. Cool. So like I said, I'm going to break the explanation of the project down into 3 phases: a research phase, an analysis phase, and a communications phase. And I've kind of broken down how each of those phases is going to address the kind of questions that we posed in the last slide. And I just wanted, before I got started, to give a super hyper brief overview so everyone kind of is planted in what the project is. And essentially what we're doing is we're trying to identify critical technologies used in wind power generation. We're trying to develop SBOMs for their firmware. And then where possible, we'd like to share the security findings that we generate from those SBOMs with all the relevant parties that we can. Super. So without further ado, let's talk about the research phase. So the research phase has several goals. The first goal was to develop a document which outlines different cyber scenarios for, and the intent of that document is to essentially discover which families of technology are of particular importance to wind generation. So what we did there is, with consultation with scientists at the lab and also with subject matter experts in the field, we talked about how supply chain attacks on different types of technology used in wind power generation would actually affect an active plant. So the report does things like, it looks into the effects of a PLC supply chain attack, or what the effects would be if there was a supply chain attack on SCADA systems, and various other technologies. And by kind of spelling out the effects of those different supply chain attacks, we identified some critical technologies of particular concern when it comes to supply chain attacks. So once we had that document outlined and kind of those ideas hashed out, we embarked on finding some vendors to perform some market research for us. And the intent of that research was to identify critical device models, which manufacturers were manufacturing those technologies. And then finally, we wanted to come up with a plan on how we could reach out to those manufacturers and start working to start looking at those technologies. So the research portion of the project is actually already complete. So we went ahead and contacted the Newton Evans Research Company. Newton Evans was able to do lots of relevant market research for us. And these are some of the key findings that we discovered from that research. So we have a better understanding of the key components, which are relevant in supply chain attacks on wind power generation. We have a map of key vendors. We have some basic market data, which points to which companies and vendors are largest in those areas of technologies. And Newton Evans was also able to perform a survey, which gave us an idea of what different utilities and um, stakeholders of wind power generation equipment and what type of technology they were using. And the kind of conclusion there was, after doing all that research, we have a general idea of which companies we'd like. Sounds like we had an echo there. Gabriella, could you mute your mic, please? Thanks.
Yes, I apologize.
Great, yeah. So as a result of that, we now have a better idea of which companies we'd like to approach and what types of technology we'd like to ask for from those companies. Cool. So now we have an idea of why certain technologies are important and who makes those technologies, and generally the relative market share for vendors that make those technologies. We've moved on into our analysis phase. So we've identified critical devices, critical vendors, and we're looking to acquire firmware from those vendors for those critical devices. So once we have that firmware, that's where the analysis can really begin. And the kind of centerpiece of that analysis is developing SBOMs for the firmware of those identified critical devices. So we'd like to generate some software bills of material from those firmwares. We'd like to kind of develop an internal database of those firmwares and start to make some kind of technology-wide, vendor-wide discoveries about what are commonalities between those different critical technologies on the most finite level. And using those findings, we know that we're going to be making some security discoveries. We're going to be making some discoveries and generalities about the software and firmware used on the critical technologies that we're looking at. And that's the general focus of the analysis phase. So here, what that process looks like, working with the company, we've kind of outlined a simple 4-step way that we can work with a company, work with them to identify critical firmware that they might have used in wind power generation. And then we can do one of two things. We can look at a company's SBOMs. If they already have SBOMs for their firmware, we can generate our own SBOMs and compare the results. Or we can create new SBOMs if those SBOMs don't exist yet. So if a partner is interested in having us generate SBOMs for them, that's something that we can do, and that work is funded by the DOE. So it essentially comes at no cost to any sort of partner that would be interested in working with us. And then once we have our SBOM generated for that firmware, we've done our analysis with our database, we've done our analysis on the SBOM itself, we can share the results of that analysis with the partners and also with the Department of Energy. Super. So that kind of segues us into the last phase of the project, which is the communications phase. So once we have the results of our analysis, we'd like to meet with vendors and asset owners where applicable, and hopefully we can communicate the security findings that we have from our analysis. So the kind of scope of communication that we have is really dependent on the vendors and the participants. So we will only communicate as much as our partner vendors allow us to. So we're flexible in the sense that where vendors want to keep any sort of trade secrets or firmware that they have private, we can work to keep those findings as private as possible. And then also, again, depending on how much we can release, we'd like to draft recommendations to the entire industry and hopefully guide general design best practices and any sort of other security problems that we become aware of. We'd like to notify the industry as much as possible. Cool. So this is a rather verbose summary. I'll leave this in the slide deck for anyone who'd like to refer to this later. It just kind of outlines specifically how we're addressing the questions I posed earlier in this presentation. But for the sake of brevity and for the sake of this presentation, I'll just kind of put up these talking points again and just kind of briefly review how we're reaching those critical points. So through our scenarios and systems document, we figured out how supply chain attacks would disrupt wind power generation by looking at how different technologies are affected by uh, supply chain attacks and how they might affect a wind plant. That answers the first two questions. Then our market research is helping us discover who makes those critical technologies, and by figuring out what their market share is, we're figuring out their presence in the wind assets market. By generating software bills of material, we're going to be making some security discoveries. And then the beneficiaries of our research are both going to be vendors, could be asset holders, utilities, and ultimately the Department of Energy. And we can inform them with industry reports, one-on-ones, and various other means. So to kind of end the presentation today, I just wanted to add that that as a participant of this presentation, there's a decent chance you may be able to help us. So these are critical things that we're currently looking for to kind of help us along with the project. So we're currently in our analysis phase. We're currently um, looking for contacts at the following companies, although this isn't an exhaustive list. Any sort of company that'd be interested in participating, any sort of company that makes technologies used in wind power generation, we'd be interested in reaching out to and trying to involve them in our project. We're also looking for any sort of software bills of material that might be open source. So if there's technologies used in wind power generation, SBOMs exist for them already, maybe we're not aware of them. We'd love to become aware of those. And then finally, any sort of firmware that's open source and is legally allowed to be subject to enumeration by with SBOMs, we'd be interested in acquiring those as well. But that just about finishes my presentation for today. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for coming today. And I guess I'll open up the board for questions.
Hi, Sean. Just noting there is a question in the chat asking whether or not you'll be able to share these slides.
Hi, yeah, I could absolutely share these slides.
And would you like people to contact you directly for that, or would you like an intermediary?
Yeah, actually, I think it'd be best if people contacted Bob Hansen. Bob's in the call. Bob, could you drop your email in the meeting chat if possible?
Yes, I can.
Thanks, Bob. Otherwise, thank you for giving me the floor today. Thanks, guys.
Okay, if there are no questions on this presentation, then we can go ahead and segue into our next presentation, which is from Jess Smith of PNNL on the regulatory environment related to SBOMs. This is not just a presentation, but more of an open discussion forum for this group to engage in, talking about why regulations are important, what kind of regulations we're talking about, and all things going on in that space. So Jess, if you're ready, please feel free to grab the screen and go ahead.
Good morning. I am ready, and I realized it is good afternoon for some of y'all. I'm Pacific, so it is still morning for me. This is a status update and a request for feedback and a request for conversation. As you might remember, a couple weeks back, we started saying, hey, okay, this group has done some awesome things, and we had a set of priorities. We've worked through the first set of those priorities. What's our next round of priorities? One of the biggest takeaways we came out of that with was regulations. What are we going to be held to? What's the standards that we've got to live to? What are the rules? What are our lines where we've got to color in? So we took that back as a to-do and started digging. And very, very briefly, if I can get there, we go. There is at present one official thing that I would call a regulation around SBOM, and that is still just that original executive order. So on one hand, we were not largely successful because the regulations that y'all were looking for don't at present exist. And that's not the be all end all, so we're gonna put a pause there. But before I move on, I did want to comment that we also did note the NIST SSDF version 1.1 calls out SBOMs, not a regulation, but something that will probably grow into being one. The National Cybersecurity Strategy that came out here recently also commented on this type of area. And then if you've been watching a little bit of what's coming out of the White House, we had the US Cyber Trust Mark program that was announced just yesterday morning. And that, while it is more focused on consumer IoT devices and consumer devices just broadly, and how do we make sure that they've got a label effectively to identify their cybersecurity, it very likely will also tie back into software bill of materials. I see those two things as eventually being the consumer face and then the back end face, or the researcher vendor face of the same thing, because we're all looking for the same thing of, okay, well, what's in this? Is it secure? Can I trust it? It's just, are we talking about my mom, who I love her dearly, but is not super cyber savvy? Or are we talking about some of the folks on this call who are very cyber savvy and need those details? So at present, this was the regulation we could find. Now, that is not to say that is the only regulation we found. We have started compiling a list of things that may or very likely will have software bill of materials included in them in some way. Now that list, as you can see, is much longer, and we started having to combine. Just it got to be way more than was reasonable to put on one slide. So you can see there's a lot more here that we're anticipating will have some kind of software bill of materials comment. Now, out of this, I've got a couple of questions for y'all, and I'm actually going to pull up the chat here so I can see that if folks want to drop things into chat. My first question for you is, are there regulations we're missing? This was a first pass. These are, again, they're not explicitly stating that they have SBOM in them, but things that likely will or will be referencing a regulation that does have SBOM. If you want to drop them in an email, please feel free to send them to me. This is going to be a continuing task for us. That was really my big takeaway from this, is that the regulations don't exist. They will exist. This task will probably continue for several years, continuing to update, continuing to identify as we see this enter the regulatory landscape more and more. So first ask from everybody is, we know we're not seeing everything. If you know of regulations that you believe should or will address SBOM in the future, please shoot me an email or drop it in the chat, and we'll make sure it gets added to the list of the ones we're monitoring. So that is my first question, my first ask. My second ask of everyone is a little bit more of I'd love to hear what y'all think today. But as you can see through this list, there's a pretty wide array. It is mostly OT focused, but there's everything on here from software assurance to event management or post-event management, or design and setup and IT systems versus the OT. There are so many different facets here that are all kind of looking at SBOM. So my second question to y'all is, when we think about this, I'd like to be on the driving side of this. I don't want to just sit back and let the federal government decide where they're going to put SBOM in the bigger landscape picture. Where does SBOM fit, though? Does it fit as a software design process regulation? Is it more of a quality control, quality assurance focus? Does it belong in the supply chain regulations like SIP 13? Does it belong with our vulnerability assessments regulations? Is there some other place that it belongs? And I'm actually going to pause there because I would love to get feedback. And like I said, drop it in the chat. Please feel free to come off mute. Where does SBOM belong? Tobias, on that comment on the drone regulations, is that Is that broad drone regulations or is that military focused drones specifically?
Right now, hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes, you're coming through great.
It's currently for blue UAS. That is currently for those seeking a DoD project. So those that have the authority to operate. So that is basically encompassing the National Defense Authorization Act set of rules and regulations specifically for 848. So that's a hard and fast rule for those that are going to use a autonomous vehicle technology for a military use case. But the green UAS is more of a similar to the blue UAS program, but requires hardware and software bill of materials for a due diligence review to identify geopolitical risk and security vulnerability risk for commercial use drones. So for those that are used for critical infrastructure, first responders and law enforcement. I can drop the link here shortly, but I just wanted to give you a heads up on those two areas.
Yes, please, and thank you. That was not something that had hit our radar at all. So that is exactly what I need. And I've dropped over into an editing window just because I want to make sure I'm getting these. If I copy and paste something incorrectly from your comments, please holler. I just want to make sure I want to make sure I capture all of these accurately. So thank you for everybody who's dropping things in the chat. This is perfect. And on Matthew Schultz, on the natural gas side, my background is more electric power with a sprinkling of DoD. Is there more coming out of natural gas? Are you seeing more come out of natural gas that's driving in this area?
So SBOM SBOM was one of the considerations that was in, and I'll have to go back through it and just make sure that they did pick that up. But it was one of the recommendations that the commission made to kind of enhance the language within the overlay. It's still burgeoning, right? So, but I think it made it in there. And while we're here, I'll double check that to make sure that's still accurate.
Wonderful, thank you. And Steve, jump in. You don't be shy.
I'm not bashful at all. So Jess, I'm a little bit hung up on the term regulation, and I think you had mentioned that do we really want this to come out through regulation, or do we want to try to get ahead of this from an industry perspective? And if you scroll back one slide, most of these items that you have on here are standards.
Yes.
Nothing that are really tied to regulatory, except the SIP aspects there. And definitely SIP 13 drives some things. But what I'd like to come back to is back in December, I sat on a panel for supply chain risk management at the DOE FERC workshop, and the outstanding voice from a lot of the different panels there were additional regulations not needed. What we need to do is make sure that we have the industry embracing what the things of like Citrix is doing, and the proving of some type of assurance level of a cyber asset before it goes into the system. And here is one thing where like NATF is working on a lot of the definitions for devices from a security perspective that are going in there. And another reason that I don't like regulatory is we start to lose a good portion of the power system because not everything is under the regulated domains.
Yes.
From that perspective. So I think what's important is to look at some of these standards, and if we can have, number one, asset owners starting to specify the use of software bill of materials in their requirements, that will definitely move the needle on the industry and the acceptance of this. I think where we're at right now is what is the use case behind the SBOM for the asset owner to say this has value to me. And this was also the same issue that we brought up a year ago, when Alan Friedman was running this exercise. So I think there we really need to come together and see how this can be used. I know from our perspective at Hitachi Energy, we're producing SBOMs for Citrix and looking at this stuff more from a development and a quality perspective. But we're not ready to actually go out and publish or provide it to a company like Tobias's, where they can do some validation on our software bill of material to give us a green bill of health on a cyber asset that may be used in the power system from that perspective. So just again, my perspective on this, it's definitely something that's coming, but I think we're still in the embryonic phase, that we still need that use case from an asset owner perspective to understand the value behind the SBOM, and then there will be a greater acceptance once the folks that are in here that are on the asset owners can justify to their senior management that this investment is worthwhile.
Excellent points, all, Steve. I tried to grab some of that. I've got some other notes on my, but that is a very good point. Everything that we're finding is standards and standards driven. Regulation is staying at the EO level for government related things, but I agree with you though. I would much rather have standards than regulations. I would rather have this be an industry driven thing than an industry followed thing.
Yeah, the other thing is, if you go back to the EO slides, a lot of these, and even the National Cyber Strategy, when we had an early look at that in January with Sherry Caddy, it doesn't focus at all on ICS and OT systems. Same with 14028. It's really focused on software systems from an IT perspective. So we need to get also, DOE and the other government agencies to realize that the OT part of the system needs to be included in some of these recommendations and strategies that are coming out.
Very much agree. Thank you very much. Yep, I agree with Joseph. And to folks who've got your hands up, please just feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so I guess maybe piggybacking off of that comment on, what's the use case for the asset owner. As an asset owner, the use case is difficult. What I've seen so far is an SBOM is valuable when we're procuring a new asset. Before we put it into production, we go through a penetration test process for that asset. We'll either contract it out or perform it ourselves to try to validate the security of the asset before we put it into production and before we buy it in bulk. So having an SBOM makes the penetration test more effective, because our penetration testing teammates have more information about the underpinnings of the software and can, instead of black box testing it, they can target their approach. So it gives us a little bit more confidence that we're doing an effective testing. However, for the value of the production of an SBOM from an asset owner perspective is it gives us confidence that whoever we're purchasing product from has a good handle on their CI/CD processes, that they're executing best practice, and that they're delivering secure equipment. We will, as this space matures, get to a place where if you can't produce a quality SBOM and VEX, that's going to say a lot about your ability to develop secure equipment, and will drive purchasing decisions. We're not there yet because this is immature, but what I would say is we need to encourage everybody to get to a place where you're able to produce high quality SBOM and VEX, validating that you have secure programming practices, and kind of having a confidence factor that the appropriate due diligence has been done for the code development.
Matthew, if you don't mind, I'm going to chime in before you, just to respond back to TJ. So
Yeah.
Yes, TJ, definitely appreciate that. But I also see that the biggest value is going to be through the lifecycle management of your install base. Especially when you go into the OT systems in a substation, that are put in there and expected to last 20 years. So here the SBOM can actually support your management of vulnerabilities that may be in the systems, that you have a legacy product that's no longer patched, that you at least are aware of a vulnerability being in that system, that you can provide other mitigations versus a patch on that device. So,
Yeah.
but I think this is really what we need to articulate in this group, or what is the vision of this, and how can we look at this and put these concepts together. So I absolutely agree. Maturity of an organization, if you're producing SBOMs, you're using that internally like we are to validate that we don't have any vulnerabilities in a new product that's going out. But then also post delivery or purchase of that product, how do you manage the life cycle of it? So sorry, Matt, I just wanted to chime in there.
Yeah, I think lifecycle management is absolutely a valuable use case. I think for a lot of large asset owners, asset inventory management is a struggle, and so I think most of us are maturing in that space, and that's a kind of predecessor step before we get into really effective lifecycle management, including SBOMs, but we need to get there. So I agree with you directionally. I just think it's a little bit farther down the line before we get to that.
And Matt, feel free to jump in here.
Excellent, Jess. I was just following up. The LNG overlay. I found what I was looking for, and it does not call out SBOM directly. It's burgeoning, right? So it talks about validation of firmware and software using hashes and so forth. But it's something that it'll be one to watch that will probably pick that up as other standards pick it up.
Perfect. I will add it to our list of regulations to be keeping an eye on then. Or our list of standards, excuse me. Gotta watch my terminology there.
Thank you.
Yep.
But this is Tobias again. The one thought I had about the R word regulation, if you look within the the details of the SIP standards, I think folks are generally very have a very good understanding of what tools and technologies that they typically use from a security perspective to implement the controls for compliance. But if you look really at the objectives of vulnerability management, configuration management, and patch management within the fabric of the SIP standards, there's nothing in there that would provide or give a company pause to utilize SBOMs in implementing those particular controls. And I'd probably even go further in saying that there may need to be some level of communication to help those asset owners understand how SBOMs can be used to meeting the standards that they have to meet every day. And in some cases, the SBOMs could be a very effective use, a very effective tool, especially when you have to manage vulnerabilities of critical systems, manage the configuration changes of critical systems, and they may not be aware of some of those use cases of SBOMs to use them in their day-to-day compliance activities. So I'd throw that out there as a consideration as well.
Circling back on that, those use cases, when I think of my mental picture of the average owner operator, there's several entities within that I could see leveraging SBOM data. Obviously, there's just our security folks, our compliance folks. Is there also a way, though, that we can tie this into our day-to-day operators use case, or should we just be focusing on the security people?
I don't see a day-to-day operations use.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I see it predominantly for procurement folks outside of security, obviously compliance as well, and possibly your legal teams and negotiating contracts with the suppliers. But I don't see necessarily an operational use case per se.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I'm gonna, if folks want to revisit, chat window, I'm monitoring. If you have other feedback you'd like me to capture here, please, like I said, here's my email. Feel free to use it. We had a little bit of discussion in the chat about where SBOM should go. My final question for you all is just we're going to continue monitoring. We're going to continue evaluating regulations, trying to figure out how do we fit in here. The other big piece, and I think this actually ties to that use case discussion, was exploring some of the different tools, how they tie into the regulations. And I'm going to put standards, because to me, the tools in a lot of ways also help us. They need to be a part of that use case discussion. So that was identified as our next step. Were there other things? I've got a lot of notes scribbled here for continuing monitoring, looking at the use cases. I'll actually add that here so I don't forget. Use case definitions. Are there other things that y'all would like to see out of this that we need to keep our brains moving on? And if you don't think of any now, and you wake up in the middle of the night and you have a burning thought about, hey, we need to do this with SBOMs, you can email me at that point too. Just because I'm sure that that's all of our constant thoughts is how to do this. So. All right, I'm not hearing anything. So I'm probably going to go ahead and bounce this back to Andrew. Folks, I'm probably not going to release these slides right now just because I was using them as Scratchpad. We will be releasing a proper report that has a lot of the information about the standards that we are tracking so that everybody's aware of what we're up to. But other than that, folks, thank you guys very much. And it's always a pleasure talking to you. Andrew, all yours.
Thanks, Jess. That was great. So I have a final question, or perhaps a plea to the community here, that if you are located outside of the United States or familiar with the regulatory environment in Europe or in Asia, Tomo, if you're still on the call, Japan is always doing some interesting things. Please reach out. I'll put my email in the chat. Please reach out to me with any updates on the regulatory environment abroad, standard contract clauses that are coming out, any kind of agreements that you're seeing, any work that's being done elsewhere we want to be aware of so that we're not reinventing the wheel. So if you're aware of anything of this kind, I'll put my email in the chat. Please reach out to me and let me know. Otherwise, there is not much more for us to cover today. So if there are no further questions in response to just the general state of the industry or either of the presentations, then I am ready to close the call. I'll pause for a moment while I wait for questions.
Andrew,
Okay.
I had one
Hearing no
follow-up question.
questions, thank you all for joining today. Yeah, go ahead.
I have one follow-up question for Jess and perhaps the individual who was talking about the use cases. Would it be helpful to pull out a use case for something in both, either that cuts through the IT and the OT environments, and one that is specifically in the OT environments? And I was thinking, Log4j obviously was still and continues to be a major hard nut to crack, as it were. And then the vulnerable TCP/IP stacks in the real-time operating systems like Wind River is another one that may suffice to give folks a reason to look for these things that are possibly deeply embedded in integrated software, so that you don't have kind of a ability to see these things just from the surface. And then tie that to the compliance aspect for the utility operators, and I think that really shows why it's important and the benefit of it.
So the way that I think about SBOM and, an application such as Log4j is that in the use case that you have some sort of end-of-life equipment that's no longer supported, having an SBOM for that will give you the autonomous ability to be able to look and see if there's if the product you're using is susceptible to Log4j. In general practice, especially for equipment that's still in service, having a complete and accurate inventory of SBOMs of all of the equipment on our system, if we assume that, which is making a huge assumption, then yes, we can independently quickly scan our inventory and identify what equipment has that susceptibility or potentially has that susceptibility and take mitigating actions. The way that we assess and analyze that now is we rely on our vendors to tell us, hey, we've analyzed our code and these pieces of equipment, these devices are susceptible. Go ahead and take mitigating actions while we're working on a patch. And then we're reliant still upon our vendor to produce a patch, test it, go through that rigor before we can kind of remediate the vulnerability. So if we had a complete and accurate inventory of all of our assets and all of the software elements of it, then yes, we can shortcut to the vulnerability analysis within our kind of equipment, within whether it's a plant or our systems. It gives us a little bit of extra kind of time and our ability to autonomously identify it ourselves. But as it stands right now, our process of, having our vendors verify, yes, we've done our analysis. Yes, this is exploitable. This is a risk. This is an issue, or no, it is not, even though, a library may be used that is susceptible, it may be otherwise mitigated within the application itself. So that's where you get the need for the VEX. And so from a utility perspective, the amount of net additional value in having an inventory of SBOM to shortcut the vulnerability analysis and management doesn't give us a huge amount of value on top of what we're already doing. However, if our vendor partners have quick and easy access and mature procedures, and they're able to them having mature processes for CI/CD, for SBOM, et cetera, will allow them to more quickly analyze if they are susceptible and then respond out to any of their customers and help shortcut the process. So I think it's more valuable if the vendor partners have maturity in that space in shortcutting the analysis and eventual remediation than it is as a customer. But us as a customer having autonomy is valuable for us. And, I think eventually we will want to get there. That's kind of my generic thoughts. I'm open to criticism or pushback if you disagree.
Yeah, I was just providing a couple of examples that would be useful within the industry. I don't discount what you say, and this is obviously something that's going to be brought in the larger, more mature utilities from the onset, right? This isn't going down to the co-op and the muni level anytime soon.
That was a nice long pause. Are there any further questions or discussion topics? Okay, hearing nothing, then I'm satisfied to conclude today's call. If you all have, again, any thoughts on the regulatory environment abroad, standard contract clauses, any kind of language you're seeing in agreements related to SBOMs and the procurement of software equipment or related services, please do email me with that information. We would love to have it. Additionally, if you have any desire as to what our next meeting should be or what any future meeting should cover, please feel free to reach out to me at the same email address. We love to hear your input. We're doing this for the community. So if you have thoughts on that, please do share. Okay, thank you everyone for joining today. I'm happy to have you here and we look forward to seeing you again next month.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.